Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly monumental, honestly mind-bending geopolitical event, the June 2026 US-Iran Framework Agreement. What we're dealing with here is a highly fragile 14-point Memorandum of Understanding. I mean, this thing literally emerged from the fires of a brutal military conflict, and right now it's resting almost entirely on a very strict, incredibly tense 60-day window. We're going to break down exactly what this framework actually does, what it intentionally ignores, and ultimately, what rests on its success. So, right off the bat, we got to ask the billion-dollar question. Is the Middle East actually at peace right now? Or did we just hit the pause button? Like, is this 14-point agreement a permanent solution? Or is it just a temporary bridge over a much larger, ongoing conflict? To figure that out, we have to look directly at what the source material tells us about the sheer architecture of this deal. Okay, here's our roadmap for unpacking this incredibly dense treaty. We'll start with the transition from war to the framework, take a look inside the 14-point agreement itself, and then examine the economic and nuclear freezes. After that, we'll compare the 2015 and 2026 deals, dive into the clashing negotiating styles, and wrap up by asking, will this peace actually hold? All right, part one. From war to framework, halting the 107-day conflict. Look, to truly understand the stakes here, you have to grasp the sheer scale of the confrontation that led up to it. This wasn't some sudden, out-of-nowhere escalation. It was a total domino effect. Back in 2025, U.S. strikes severely damaged Iranian nuclear infrastructure. But rather than ending the threat, it kind of just postponed it. Fast forward to February 2026, and a devastating 107-day regional war breaks out. We're talking direct U.S. military operations, a massive naval blockade, and cascading violence across secondary fronts like Lebanon. It wasn't until June 17, 2026, after some serious war fatigue had set in on both sides, that they finally signed this electronic 14-point Memorandum of Understanding. Now, here is the kicker. This framework doesn't magically solve everything overnight. Instead, it creates what the sources call the 60-day window. This is a strict, ticking diplomatic timetable. Think of it as a temporary holding pattern, a fragile bridge between active military confrontation and a potential long-term settlement. They essentially froze the battlefield just so technical experts and legal teams could desperately try to draft a real peace treaty without bombs dropping in the background. Moving into part two, inside the 14-point agreement, the immediate reciprocal wins. So what did they actually agree to right out of the gate? Well, it brilliantly illustrates the whole strategic architecture of the deal. Reciprocal sequence trade-offs. The United States agrees to lift its punishing naval blockade, halt new military deployments, and issue immediate treasury waivers to allow Iranian oil exports. In direct exchange, Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz, physically neutralize naval mines, and guarantee safe commercial passage. It's a strict philosophy of trust through performance. You only get the concession when you demonstrably perform the action. And guys, we literally cannot overstate the global impact of reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of the world's globally traded crude oil passes through that narrow little corridor. Reopening it immediately lowered oil price volatility and restored international shipping confidence. This was a massive, massive relief worldwide, but especially for countries like India. India relies heavily on West Asian energy, and importantly, it has one of the world's largest seafaring communities. The blockade directly threatened thousands of Indian sailors, so getting this strait open again was a critical diplomatic win for global maritime security. Which brings us to part three. The economic and nuclear freeze, basically pausing the absolute hardest issues. Okay, so we've seen the immediate fixes, right? But what about the deep, underlying issues that sparked the war in the first place? Well, they kind of just punted them into the 60-day window. One of the most staggering numbers to come out of this leaked MOU is this: $300 billion. This is a proposed economic development and reconstruction initiative. Now, just to be super clear, the agreement doesn't establish this giant fund immediately. It basically directs the negotiators to try and design the financing architecture during that 60-day window. And as you can probably guess, this is intensely debated. Supporters are arguing, look, this $300 billion rehabilitation of infrastructure, telecommunications, housing, energy facilities is absolutely essential because economic collapse almost always fuels renewed regional instability. But critics, they are raising massive red flags. They're questioning where on earth this money comes from, who is overseeing it, and fundamentally whether offering such a generous package essentially rewards adversarial behavior right after a 107-day war. And then, yeah, the nuclear elephant in the room. When the hostilities ended, Iran reportedly retained around 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. Instead of actually solving this, the framework just freezes the status quo. Iran agrees not to expand enrichment, and the U.S. agrees not to impose new sanctions. That means over the next 60 days, they have to navigate these massive hurdles, determining maximum enrichment percentages, finalizing centrifuge numbers, and establishing a joint verification mechanism that both sides actually trust, which historically has been incredibly difficult, if not impossible. All right, part 4, the 2015 versus 2026 deals. Call it the ghosts of Lausanne. To really wrap our heads around this new framework, we have to contrast it with the historic 2015 nuclear accord, the JCPOA. What's fascinating here is the sheer evolution of the crisis. I mean, the 2015 deal was a multilateral agreement involving 6 world powers, and it was laser-focused on highly technical, non-proliferation objectives. Things like dropping centrifuges from 19,000 down to around 6,100. The 2026 framework? Vastly different beast. It's primarily a bilateral arrangement between just the US and Iran, and its main focus is stopping an active, bloody military conflict. It throws security, maritime law, economic reconstruction, and nuclear issues all into one frantic, overarching process. Moving on to part 5, 2 clashing negotiating styles. It's a total collision of cultures. Beyond all the high-level geopolitics, the success of this 60-day window relies entirely on the human element. We are watching a stark collision of diplomatic philosophies here. On one side, you have Donald Trump's very well-known transactional approach, maximum pressure tactics, aggressively creating leverage, and demanding high-stakes bargains on highly compressed timelines. On the other side, you have Iranian negotiator Abbas Araghchi. His style is completely rooted in strategic patience, gradual incrementalism, and institutional endurance. He leans heavily on the Persian cultural concept of taraf, which is this highly sophisticated form of ritualized politeness that can brilliantly obscure deeply entrenched, unyielding negotiating positions. It is a fundamental clash of strategic cultures. And finally, part 6, will the peace hold? The ticking clock. So, with all these clashing forces, delayed agendas, and just profound mistrust, what are the actual odds that this fragile 60-day bridge survives? Well, our sources lay out some pretty sobering probabilities. A short-term ceasefire holding for, say, 1 to 3 months, that's highly probable, sitting at about 70 to 80%, largely driven by mutual war fatigue and the immediate economic relief of reopening trade routes. A comprehensive nuclear settlement, that drops to a coin toss, around 40 to 50%, heavily complicated by intense verification disputes. But full U.S.-Iran normalization? The odds there are staggeringly low, at just 20 to 30%, severely limited by deep ideological rivalry and decades of institutional mistrust. And those odds are low for a reason, because to get to normalization, they have to clear some absolute mountains. First, U.S. congressional oversight under the IRA Act. This means Congress is going to heavily scrutinize and potentially block any sanctions relief. Second, they actually have to structure a permanent sanctions architecture. Third, there is the massive external variable of Israel, which historically favors sustained military pressure over Iranian regional integration, especially with everything going on across secondary fronts. And finally, they still have to figure out what to do with that 60% enriched uranium stockpile. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from our sources today. This framework is, quote, a diplomatic bridge between war and peace, a temporary pause between 2 phases of a much larger conflict. Yes, the fighting has stopped for now, and the ships are moving again. But literally everything that caused the war is still sitting right there on the negotiating table, just waiting for the clock to run out. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. Will the next 60 days truly transform this fragile truce into a sustainable, historic regional settlement? Or are we all merely sitting through a brief intermission before the global conflict resumes? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and until next time, keep questioning the world around you.